Here we go. So Susan asked me, and Trudy asked me what we're going to do next. And one of the things that I had suggested was a book by Barry Holtz, which is not a new book. It's called Back to the Sources. I wasn't sure if it was still in print, but it is in print, in which it's an edited volume, but where each chapter is written by another scholar on an important Jewish text and what its purpose is. So I think there are an awful lot of texts, the Mechilta, and a lot of other texts, the Sifrei and the Sifra. What are those things? And what were their purposes? So that's my thought at this point. So we're in chapter 10 and 11, and there are 18 chapters. So we're moving right along. So you remember chapter 10, which we read in the beginning. It may have resounded differently reading it again. And just as a quick review and beginning of part 3, our author says that who is this book addressed to? Who is the guide addressed to? To people who were distressed by the externals of the law and by the meanings of the law mentioned. The meanings of the law mentioned equivocal, derivative, or amphibolous terms. That these are, anybody ever, it's too long to be a Scrabble word, but amphibolous means, anybody? I have to look it up. Doubtful or equivocal. Doubtful terms are equivocal terms. So just people who are distressed by the externals of the law, by the meanings of the above mentioned equivocal, derivative, or amphibolous terms. That what Maimonides was addressing was the contrast between Judaism and the surrounding culture, and which required intellectuals or thinking Jews, required them to choose one or the other, either Judaism or the surrounding culture. Maimonides was determined that one should not have to make that choice, but he was clear that he was addressing not Amcha, not ordinary Jews. He was addressing the exceptional individual, right? And we said before, Maimonides was an elitist. So in chapter 10, the issue was that he's dealing with reconciling revelation and reason. Revelation is that which is God revealed, as opposed to reason, which is the aspect of philosophy, which means one makes a choice between God's wisdom as revealed, or man's wisdom as comes from reason and philosophy. But he says clearly, I wrote with an asterisk, the nature of revelation is not an alternative to reason, but revelation, according to Maimonides, is an achievement of reason itself, which is a pretty outrageous statement, that revelation is the most elevated expression of reason. That's his perspective. But our author points out there is perplexity in reason itself, which is the subject of the rest of the book, subject of this section. There's a disagreement as to what Maimonides himself thought on a lot of questions. There were those who say that at base, Maimonides was an Aristotelian philosopher. Others who say that Maimonides was a mystic. And the third group that tries to prove in reading Maimonides that he was a conservative traditionalist. Well, he probably was some combination of all three. He explains that in the Mission of Torah, which is the outline of Jewish practice, Jewish law, and there's only one opinion. If you've ever studied Talmud, you know that that's not how the Talmud operates. The Talmud is argumentation over almost everything, and sometimes they come to a conclusion on the argument. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they even end the argument by saying teku. We don't even know what teku means, but one of the explanations is it stands for Tishbi, Yashiv, Shuvot, teku. Kushiot, Tishbi, Eliyahu Tishbi, right? I don't know what a tishbite is because that's usually how it's translated, but Elijah, the tishbite, will come and answer. So sometimes in the Talmud, they'll say, we don't know the answer. And they'll leave the argument there. Maimonides gives one opinion. He gives, this is the law, not, some do it this way and some do it that way. And here's the reason for this, and here's the reason for that. Here's Shammai, here's Hillel. No, Maimonides gives in the Mission Torah one opinion because to assert that halacha has absolute authority, whereas in the guide, this is very important, the guide is there to undermine the absolute commitment to any one point of view, that the guide includes deliberate ambiguity. Which for anybody who's confused, that's the purpose. Barbara.
I have a question. I know that a lot of schools, the very, very Orthodox schools, the Dati'im are named Maimonides, like the day school for the Jewish girls. So my question as I'm reading more and more of Maimonides, it's like, why are they naming their schools after Maimonides because of the Mission of Torah and not because of the Guide to the Perplexed of answering things in an Aristotelian view and all of that? Like, why did they pick that name? Because when you read what he's thinking, all the different ways and this and that, it doesn't follow the straight path, but yet the schools probably do. Do you know why they're all called Maimonides?
You mean, is the straight path mean the party line as you understand it?
The halacha, like you have to follow halacha. Here's the one answer. You do it, and that's what they're teaching at the school, I'm guessing. But
that's right.
Yeah. Okay. So they are ignoring the Guide for the Perplexed and going for the Mission of Torah when they name their school Maimonides.
No, they're really saying, as just what we just said, behavior is sacrosanct. Thought is, what you think may. Now, I don't know whether in Orthodox schools, even at the high school level, that they teach the guide. They teach the Mission of Torah, but he's already included. Have been very impressed. Ideas from the Mission of Torah, which are problematic. He's included in here as well. So, Alan.
Yes, so it just so happens for about the past 10 years, I've been on the board of directors of the Maimonides Jewish Day School. This is a question that, this is a question that has never come up. We have a board meeting this coming Monday, and I will ask that question. The one thing that I can say is that we no longer go beyond grade 8. The question of what is taught in the high school is a moot question. But I will ask that question on Monday, and report back on Thursday, God willing.
Okay. 1 second, I have to one more admit here. And I would guess, Alan, I would guess that the answer that you might get is, of course we teach the guide. But that answer is by people who've never studied the guide. Because what we're going to get to in just a minute is, is the most shocking. So the end of chapter 10 is the question where there's ambiguity, where Maimonides offers multiple opinions. What is Maimonides' opinion? And there are those who believed that he believed one view, even though he may have given 2 or 3 or 4. He believed one view, and he gave the others to camouflage the truth. Wow. So there are others who say he gave these views because he, in fact, was undecided. And the third view is that Maimonides inhabited the tension. In other words, not that he was undecided, but when I teach the Introduction to Judaism class, and often I teach, I don't think I'm teaching this year, that I teach the theology, the one session on God and theology. The second half, I talk about 3 different Jewish theologians. I talk about Heschel, I talk about Buber, I talk about Kaplan. They are very different. And I must say, I don't know that I'm undecided about, but I think I inhabit the tension. I mean, sometimes when I really feel very, very much Heschelian, and other times when I feel, that Buber speaks to me, or Kaplan. So, so what Maimonides actually believed is left there in doubt. So we get to chapter 11. And what I want to do before we read chapter 11 is I want to look at the very last paragraph. Let's go to the last paragraph, which is on page 185, which is shocking. The last paragraph, page 185, everybody there, or if you have the book. The reader who has navigated all of Maimonides' hidden and revealed assumptions and reached these conclusions may confront an intellectual crisis. After a long, complex, and somewhat dry discussion that extends over many chapters of the guide, the reader who has successfully followed the arguments recognizes that he does not know how the world came into existence and cannot even have certainty about the existence of God. Whoa! Here's the the ultimate authority for so many, and you read through it, and at the end you say, "Oh my God, he's not even sure if God exists," or he will present many proofs. He believes God exists, but these proofs have holes. Anybody shocked by this conclusion? Alan,
I can't say that I'm shocked, although I guess I am, but it's a classic conundrum. If you say that you understand how the world came into existence and understand about the existence of God, then what we're saying is you don't understand. And if you're saying you don't understand it, then you understand everything that Maimonides has said. It's classic.
Okay. So interesting that the battle over the proof of the existence of God is over this whole issue of creation. By the way, one of the things I find fascinating in all of these proofs, it appears that Maimonides does not use the biblical text in any way as either proof or support. He doesn't say, it appears that I'm coming down on the side of creation, which he does, and to say, and that's what we read in the Bible. That's what we read in the first chapter of the Torah. He doesn't say that. Somehow the Bible is not used, the Torah is not used as proof, as of anything. Proof has to come from extra biblical sources. Proof has to come sort of from philosophical. So our author says that the issue was the world created, or is the world is the universe eternal? It's so interesting. You wonder, what did they really know about astronomy in the 12th century? I don't know the answer to that, but clearly, we have come down to the fact that there was that the world somehow was created, right? We come down to no, what's the term?
The Big Bang.
The Big Bang. That's right. We come down and because I think we come to the Big Bang because, well, we can't come up with anything else. We're trying to get closer and closer to the idea of trying to prove it. But the idea that the world was created in the 12th century was associated with the Islamic philosophical school called Kalam. And from that school, not only do they assert that the world was created, but since the world was created, it proves God's unity. And since it proves God's unity, it also proves God's incorporeality. God has no body. But Maimonides rejected many of these Kalam arguments as proof. He says that God's unity is from this, God's unity is not convincing. Also incorporeality, and that the conclusions undermine the premises is really what he says. So in all of this, one of the things we have to think about is Maimonides justifying, does Maimonides see his purpose simply as justifying Aristotelian philosophy? Or is he challenging even Aristotelian philosophy in his thinking? So for Aristotle, it was logically impossible that the world was created. Because the motion of the spheres, which I assume he means the planets, is circular, and therefore partakes in perfection. It's not subject to decay, therefore it never came into being, and therefore the world, as far as Aristotle is concerned, is eternal. And the second proof is, just as it's impossible that the deity should become non-existent, or that his existence should undergo a change, So all existence is eternal. So from the existence of God, we get that. It says that if the world was created by God, that would mean that God has a will. And if God has a will, then God is not perfect, which is not possible. And therefore, creation assumes a change in God who wants at a certain moment in time to create. So Maimonides is not wholly convinced. He saw seeds of doubt. He sowed seeds of doubt and comes up with his very interesting parable. Did you find this interesting? The parable of the young man who grew up in a desert island. I don't know why always the island has to be desert, but he grew up all by himself on an island. He cannot conceive how human beings come into existence. And when he asks, he's told about the birds and the bees, and he refuses to believe what he's told, that a fetus is created in the womb of a woman, because how would that fetus breathe in the womb? How would that fetus eat? And how would that fetus excrete? All these things that human beings need to do, and therefore he would not believe the explanation. So what do we get from that? That what we look at is the world as it is, and there may be things that we don't know, that we get from this parable. Aristotle is weak because his conception of the universe is only from the final state, and he can't describe the past because he only has observations of the present. He's like the young man on the desert island who can't conceive of conception. He can't. So this second, so that's his argument against Aristotle. His second argument is that all of Aristotle's argument is about God's absolute perfection, and that if God has a will, in other words, if the world was created means that God has a will, and that God made a decision to create. And if God has a will, it's evidence of imperfection, a will to create, which is not possible. There is a, and so how do we exert our will as human beings? Our will as human beings comes from a certain desire, whether that's to eat or to move or whatever our will is, that our desire is a response to some lack or need. But God's will is other. God's will does not come from desire. It's not conditioned, that our will is somehow conditioned by the environment. And God's will is not conditioned by the environment, and therefore God's will is no sign of imperfection. Everybody follow that argument, right? Okay. So here were two ways in which Maimonides argues with the Aristotelian idea. So we have Rambam's original view, Maimonides' original views for creation. He says creation is a plausible belief. It's a more reasonable hypothesis that the world was created. He's not taking a very strong position, but it's more reasonable. And how does he get to this notion? Well, the Aristotelian belief was based on the movement of the planets. The planets move in a very orderly, and the universe is very orderly. But Maimonides observes that there were certain bodies whose motion could not be explained. The motion of the stars. Somehow the planets were set in motion, but their direction and the speed of the planets were islands of what are called non-rationality. And since there were these certain bodies whose motion could not be explained, and we still really did not understand everything about the planets, one must conclude, therefore, that all of that is because of the will of God, because God intervenes. So Aristotle believed in the absolute order of nature. Epicurus said there was no order in nature. And Maimonides wants to take a middle road. Maimonides says that there is order, but the order is not absolute. There's also chaos. But so because the order is not absolute, for creation, the creation of the world is the most reasonable view. And now he gives two proofs. One proof based on the idea that the universe was created, and the other proof is based on the world that it's always existed. If the world was created, that's simple. If the world was created, then the world has a creator and a creator and who's eternal and an existent other. That the world is otherwise, if the world is permanent and, how did you like this word? Sempiternal. Did you see that word in there? Sempiternal. I had to look it up. That's the second word I had to look up. Also too long for Scrabble. But sempiternal simply means eternal and unchanging. Alan, what did you want to add?
No, I've got a question.
Yeah.
Back to God's will. As humans, do we prefer if God has a will or if God does not have a will?
Well, if God has a will, according to this philosophical idea, it means that God changes. And we have a lot of evidence from our Torah parables that, in fact, God changes. God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham convinces him not to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. God is determined after the golden calf that he's both two times after the golden calf and after the spies. He tells Moses, I'm going to destroy this people and I'll make you another people. And Moses convinces God that that's not a good idea. And God seems to be convinced. So it seems to me that from the parables, as Maimonides described them as parables, from the Torah itself, God seems to have a will and is not unchanging. though Maimonides seems to subscribe to pretty much to the idea that God is unchanging, or that's what we got from that first chapter.
Yeah.
So where does that leave us as fallible human beings?
Well, we have a will.
Oh, we
Yeah, I mean, we are not unchanging. Even so, the debate between environment and here these wonderful studies where you have identical twins who meet for the first time as adults, and how similar they are in their choices, in what they studied, in what profession they went into, what sports those are sort of freaky things, because we think of ourselves as completely free.
No, we're not.
Are all these things predetermined? Barbara?
Well, my question is about if God is the way God is and we have choice and everything, where is the intersection of we're created b'tselem Elohim? Like, in what way are we like God? It's non-corporeal, it's obviously, but all the other things. So what is it that we are b'tselem Elohim then, according to either Maimonides or whatever we're studying?
Well, I think that there are a lot of ways in which, I don't know what Maimonides' view is, but I think there are a lot of ways in which, we have a conscience.
God God has a conscience?
Well, what are the uniquely human attributes that we ascribe to God? The kinds of mental gymnastics that we can do that no other species can do. We're finding more and more that certain animals have abilities to do certain things that we didn't know, that they can have compassion and they can express a sense of love, and but it's still not human.
No, but that's not God. I'm saying, how are we like God? Not like different from other animals or what's special about human beings. But if God is this unchanging, no will kind of thing, this entity, how are we like that?
We're stubborn. Trudy?
Well, to me, this all goes back to chapter 1 again, where when he just his description of what he feels God is, the rest of it the book makes no sense to me, because God can't be able to change his mind and blah, 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 because he's really not intersecting with us as humans, according to him in chapter 1. But it all changes as the book goes through. And so it's very confusing to me, to say the least.
Well, God can be unchanging, but still have effects.
But does he talk to people? I mean, that goes,
No.
I mean, how could he change his mind if Abraham or Moses talked to him?
Well, because all of that Maimonides says is parable. Those are not accurate. Those are not historic events. They are parables to teach us things, but they're he has trouble. He has trouble with miracles. He has trouble with things that break the order. Alan?
Yeah, I expect that if Maimonides were here to defend himself, he would have a lot to say on these questions that Alan and the others have raised. I mean, I I expect that he would say the Torah, through the 13 divine attributes and through other places in which the Torah sort of defines godliness, is in fact defining what B'Tselem Elohim is if we live a life where we are, in his view, reaching perfection of knowledge and moral and spirituality, and at the same time employing in our daily life Torah principles that start with the divine attributes and the 10 commandments and go from there. I think he would say that is God, that godliness is your interface with God, because God is not changing. God is incorporeal. So all these stories in the Torah that talk about feet and backs and faces are nothing but parable. But at the end of the day, the messages within the Torah are real, because those are how we can see God and interact with God, given that God is not something you can touch, feel, or have a conversation with.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps what we could say, I don't know if this is exactly what you were saying, Alan, but God is unchanging and perfect. What is being in the image of God is our human efforts to emulate that perfection. That's our aspiration, or ought to be our aspiration, to be godlike. In our interactions as human beings, in our interactions with each other, in how we create the world. Is that how do you like that, Barbara? That's
Yes, feeling better about that.
okay.
Alan and Rabbi Isaac.
So in the end, let me see if I skipped anything here. We get to finally Maimonides' metaphysical proof of God, which is that everything, we started with, there were three kinds of things in the world, things that were temporary. What were the three categories? Temporary, changing, and absolute. Those were not the three categories, something like that. So that if we assume that everything must be subject to corruption, in other words, nothing is eternal. If all can undergo corruption, then it's impossible that anything exists, for no one could bring anything into existence. And since there are things that exist and have not been corrupted, there must be some that are not subject to generation and corruption. And therefore, there are necessary existence that sustain the world. That every possible existence will decay and at some point not exist. And since the world exists, there must be things that are necessary which sustain existence. We assume that the world exists. But all of that is based on the postulate, the assumption that the world exists for an infinite span of time, because it's very possible for at some time in the future for the world not to exist. And if we continue with our corruption, I don't mean manual corruption, but I mean our physical corruption of the world, there's perhaps every reason to be concerned that the world may not exist. And therefore, if and therefore, even this last proof of God, that there are things that are eternal, is still open to doubt, and therefore you get to that last paragraph where it's uncertain that Maimonides is certain about how one behaves as a Jew, but not certain about the existence of whether the world is eternal or not. Even so, he postulates that that's a better guess than that the world is created is a better assumption than that the world is. And he doesn't have a great proof for the existence of God, which is how he comes, where our author summarizes all of the long discussion. I'm not sure if Maimonides wants us to come to that conclusion, but our author, who has tried to get through all the things, that's where he comes out. I'm reading Alan's comment where he writes, I'm more confused than ever. I think this is a good thing. Alan.
And if I may add to that, Rabbi,
Yeah.
I was just thinking about the book that you were discussing as our next book. And my thought was that if that book clarifies things for us, I'm actually less interested in reading it.
No, it's not necessarily a book of philosophy. This, it's a book about what I'm suggesting. What are these other texts in Judaism, and what purpose have they served? So, Alan Blank, you had your hand up.
Yeah. So just, I didn't read that last paragraph as quite as starkly as you did. I read it more in the context of creation, which is the chapter it's dealing with. And there you could understand why Maimonides, living 1,500 years after Aristotle, would really struggle, because Aristotle had it wrong. There's too much science that's come along in those 1,500 years to stick with what Aristotle had to say about creation. And so he then looks with his own lens of what he knows, and it's very difficult, any more than it is 1,000 years after Maimonides, for us to sit and know what the hell actually happened at the very beginning that created the universe. And so he comes up a little bit shy of being able to prove one way or t'other on creation. But I don't think, it may be an overstatement of those words to think that he doesn't have a concept of God, because he went to all that trouble of those proofs of God's existence and incorporeality. So I don't think it's fair to say that Maimonides is struggling to prove God's existence, but he definitely is, as are we today, struggling to prove whether God is responsible for the creation of the universe.
Yeah, I have no doubt that Maimonides believed in the existence of God.
Yeah.
But I think that what our author is coming to at the end is these proofs have holes in them. They're not as absolute as Maimonides would like us to think. What was that lesson? The reader who has successfully followed the arguments recognizes he does not know how the world came into existence, right? He postulates, creation is better than absolute, and cannot even have certainty about the existence of God. Yeah, no, I have no doubt that, when Maimonides comes up with his list of 613 commandments, the first one is the existence of God. But I also, throughout this book, I may have mentioned it last week, I wonder whether over these years of his writing the Mission of Torah, and then the years of writing the guide, whether his own ideas changed, whether he had some personal evolution in his thinking as to what not that it would undermine his connection or the absolute feeling about halacha, but I wonder when he got to philosophy whether it raised questions for him that he hadn't come to conclusions about, and now had to struggle with some of these ideas that maybe he never thought about before. Barbara?
If now that we know that the earth and the world, I mean, the universe is not eternal, we know that it started at some point, and we also know that it's going to end. I mean, there was a whole science show about, the stars die. They're not, like Aristotle said, just based on what Alan is saying, what we knew 3,000 years ago, what we knew 1,500 years ago, and what we know today. So because we know that there is no eternalness to the universe, then that is a proof, according to this, then, that God had to create it, right? There's either eternal or
Right.
created. Well,
Right.
It isn't eternal. We know that from studying astronomy now. We know nothing's eternal. None of the stars are eternal. Nothing's eternal. That means, therefore, God had to have created it. God had to have got it started, and who knows if when it ends, God's going to start it again or start something. So maybe the more we learn about science and astronomy, the stronger our proof is, according to this way of arguing, that there really is God, the creator.
I skipped one short section, which he before he gets to his third proof, where he says, if it's created, it assumes a creator, but not necessarily that it was one God or God at all. Maybe there was it was created. We're postulating something that we call God, but maybe the world came into being some other way. So that what you're raising as an absolute, he's questioning. He questioned in our text as well. I hope you're in following this, that you're feeling this is a guide for the perplexed, and I think the idea is once you read it, you will no longer be perplexed.
No.
And I don't think that's
No.
where I don't think that's where we're kind of coming out. Nor do I have a sense that people who read the guide in the 12th century came out. But the community that's reading this are not only intellectuals, but they are observant intellectuals. And I don't think that anything that Maimonides writes undermined their observance, their commitment to Shabbat, their commitment to kashrut, their commitment to tefillah, to prayer, their commitment to observing the holidays. As a matter of fact, I wonder whether Maimonides raised issues with for certain people that they had never thought about before. And now they were really perplexed. Alan?
And back to Barbara's argument, the fallacy of what you said is that you seem to understand it. And according to the author of our book, if you seem to understand it, then it's clear that you don't understand it.
Yeah, well, but I think that Micah Goodman does a good job in going through a lot of material, contradictory material sometimes, and summarizing for us really what Maimonides is saying. Because I'm not sure anybody at any time read through the Guide for the Perplexed in one shot. They didn't read it like novels. So also remember, Maimonides wrote the Mission of Torah, he wrote in Hebrew, but the Guide for the Perplexed, he wrote in Judeo-Arabic. So we're taking the Judeo-Arabic. Our author here is writing his book in Hebrew. And what we are reading is a translation from his Hebrew into English. And sometimes he really uses words that are, I had to look up two of them this week, what they really meant. All right. So
Rabbi,
I hope you're celebrating a wonderful Chinese New Year. Yes.
I'd like to suggest to the group a book that I found a couple of months ago, a small book called The Student's Companion to the Guide of the Perplexed. The author's name is Ben Zion Katz, and it's a small book, but I found it sometimes useful as a counterpoint. Again, the title is The Student's Companion to the Guide of the Perplexed.
And the last name of the author?
Ben Zion Katz.
Cats.
And that's K-A-T-Z.
Okay.
And it's on Amazon.
Do you find things in there that are contrary to what we've?
Not necessarily contrary, but in some cases, this book is written almost as a third or a fourth grade reader, which I found to be quite helpful.
Oh, okay. All right. So next week, we'll take on chapter 12 and 13. Where we go ahead with perplexity in God. I thought we were there already. And the role of doubt. Okay. Have a good week, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And we'll see you next week. I will turn this over to Jennifer.
We'll see if it works this week. Last week, for some reason, it didn't, but
It didn't. Okay.
yeah, but that's okay.
I'm making you the host.
Okay,
Change host. Got it.
I
All
got
right.
it. So I'm wondering if there's a difference in, this whole idea of behavior versus thought. That if everybody's behaving the same, if that helps. I mean, if you have the same behaviors and they're all based on a central core of belief in God, then you can have thought and pursue these discussions in a way that is different from the way I think we kind of struggle with it, which is with doubt, maybe. And I'm speaking for myself in that way, but I think it's so interesting that he wrote, that you have a whole,
The Mission of Torah.
the Mission of Torah that gives you a set of behaviors that you're supposed to follow and that they're very clear. And the assumption is if everybody's following them, then you're doing the right thing. And that almost feels separate from thought and trying to think about bigger pictures of creation.
I was wondering if he's trying to. I wonder if, because I haven't read ahead, so maybe it's in there somewhere. But it seems that he's coming to conclusion that logic cannot account for everything, because some of his proofs, if he comes to the end and says there's not a proof that really works here, but he still has belief that God exists. So somewhere he's taking that next step to say. Aristotle was great, logic and philosophy do a lot, but there are some things beyond that. And he never says that explicitly, but it's kind of between the lines a little bit for me anyway.
I think he does in that parable about the ruler in the castle, and where he's talking about halakha. You can't just do halakha, there has to be more.
Right.
You have to bring in the metaphysical, you have to bring in the philosophy, and you have to really strive to get into that inner sanctum. I think he does try a little bit there to do it with that parable.
Yeah.
I think I struggle with the idea of the Torah being parable. And in speaking to clergy sometimes, God is very much a changing entity. It's very different than what is being presented here. So it makes me wonder what influence has this writing had in really changing Judaism, and has it changed Judaism? In the way people think about God, and in the way clergy, and the way God is presented during sermons or during, in any way.
The Holocaust probably changed it more for our generation and our parents' generation and our kids' generation than Maimonides did. But if you think about the people who stayed in Germany and Poland and all the places that were run over